For Morialta.
Thank you, sir. This government over 15 and a half years has committed many atrocities upon the people of South Australia. They have put themselves before the people who they claim to serve over and over, time and time again. But in the last week, one of the most disgraceful examples of that has been put front and centre by the Minister for Education and by the Premier, who would take the extraordinary step of using children in South Australian schools as political pawns, as political hostages in their game playing with the Commonwealth. The fact is that on the 8th of January next year, half of the funding that the Commonwealth Government is to provide to South Australia's schools, $1.3 billion, half of that is due to be paid to South Australia's schools on the 8th of January. That's nearly $500 million to South Australia's public schools. That's $412 million to South Australians' independent schools, and $383 million to South Australia's Catholic schools is due to be paid by the Commonwealth to those schools and those systems next year, half of it on the 8th of January. And this Minister and this Premier have put all of that funding in jeopardy because they refuse to sign a statement of principles with the Commonwealth that gives the Commonwealth the legal mechanism under the Education Act federally to pay. The failure of this government to do that puts our students at risk. It puts the needs of this government's political point scoring and headline-seeking desire for attention ahead of the needs of our children. The members who sit behind them stand condemned. They claim to care for our children, they claim to care for our schools, but by their actions, by signing a completely inoffensive document, the principle of which I will outline in a moment, they identify themselves as hypocrites, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, who do not care about the interests of our children, who only care about political point scoring and game playing. $491 million to South Australia's public schools, $383 million to South Australia's Catholic schools, $412 million to South Australians' independent schools. All it needs is for the Minister for Education to sign a document. And what does that document say that is so offensive that the member for Torrens wants her schools to lose millions of dollars because signing this document is all that needs to happen? The government is asked to sign an agreement that the Commonwealth and the states are jointly responsible for developing, progressing and reviewing national objectives and outcomes for schooling, that the Commonwealth and states committed to ambitious long-term school improvements underpinned by quality reform plans based on evidence of what works to support progress towards achieving national and state and territory goals and targets, that the Commonwealth and the states and the territories are jointly funding and regulating the Australian school sector. It goes on to talk about consultation and collaboration. It says specifically, agreement to these principles for the purpose of establishing an interim agreement does not indicate intention on the part of any state or territory to enter into a future national schools agreement. There is nothing stopping the government from signing this document and continuing to argue for increased funding from the federal government. There is nothing in this document that stops the government from continuing to argue for that. The South Australian Liberal Party, for goodness sake, we will always argue for the best deal for South Australia. We will continue to do that, and a martial Liberal government will continue to do that. But we would never put at risk funding that will help our schools. And what other impacts will it have? It's been described as playing a game of chicken. I don't always agree with Rebecca Sharkey, the member for Mayo, but she's right when she says that it's a game of chicken and only families will suffer. But what do other people say about it? The Greens, Senator Hanson-Young, says politicians must stop holding school children and their education to ransom. What about the non-government sector, who the Premier said he stood with in the balcony room in arguing against federal cuts? What about the non-government sector, who are going to be most directly affected by this, who can't rely on Treasury just to prop them up necessarily? The Australian Association of Christian Schools Chief Executive Martin Hanskamp has pleaded for Dr Close to sign the new funding agreement. He says non-government schools do not have the cash reserves to cover wages and running costs for the first half of 2018, and the Christian school sector does not appreciate being made pawns in a game of political brinksmanship. What about Carolyn Granscowns, Chief Executive of the Australian Association of Independent Schools SA? It is time to stop the squabbling between state and federal governments over school funding. It is time for all politicians to put the children of South Australia first. What about the Catholic sector? Neil McGorran, former formerly head of the SACE board. Obviously, we would like this matter to be resolved promptly. The sooner we have the certainty, the sooner the schools will be confident they have the necessary funds to support their plans for the 2018 school year. The South Australian Government's reckless game playing is putting politics before their kids, and I have a message for the Minister and the Premier and the Government. Stop it. Put our kids first, sign the agreement and let that funding roll to our schools.